Welcome to High Truths on Drugs and Addiction, where national experts bring you facts and answers. I'm your host, Dr. Ronit Lev, an emergency and addiction doctor who has served at the White House and still practices on the front lines. Right here on High Truths, you will learn from experts from around the globe and around all aspects of drugs and addiction. To grow this community of information and action, I hope you give us a 5-star review. Come visit me on hightruths.com to learn more about the show or download a free prescription for naloxone. Carrying naloxone for drugs is like carrying an EpiPen for allergies. Today's episode is sponsored by Physicians for Healthy Communities, a physician-led organization that educates on the science of prevention to improve public health. Visit their website to learn how they prevent substance misuse while supporting individuals, families, and communities. Go to physiciansforhealthycommunities.org. Hello again, High Truth listeners. Get ready for a suicide conversation. I'm your host, Dr. Ronit Lev. Suicide, a serious word, and one of the worst words and painful acts ever imagined. Sadly, I have personal experience with suicide that I wish I did not have. My adopted son, Sean, who went to high school with my son and spent many days and nights in our house, took his own life while a third year in medical school. It crushed his mother and our entire family. The stigma of suicide is worse than substance use. When my daughters were applying to medical school, one of the prompt essays was to write about overcoming adversity or tragic experience. I advised them against writing about Sean's suicide. Medical school admissions do not want to hear that their students commit suicide. In fact, we lose an entire class of medical students a year to suicide. What data tells us is that there is a great overlap in people who have a substance use disorder and any mental illness. Half of everyone, 50% of those who suffer from substance use disorder, also struggle with mental illness. And looking at medical examiner data in people with a developing brain, those under the age of 25 that died of suicide, the number one associated drug found on autopsy is THC, marijuana. THC is much more associated with suicide than alcohol in young people. To learn more about cannabis-associated suicide, I reached out to parents who lived and are still living this nightmare. Heather Bacchus is a dedicated advocate and mother whose life was forever changed by the tragic loss of her son, Randy Michael. Randy died of suicide as a result of cannabis-induced psychosis on July 17, 2021. Her son, Randy, loved marijuana and started using at a tender age of 15. He slowly developed cannabis-induced psychosis and ended his life tragically and violently because of pot. Heather and her husband, also named Randy, founded the nonprofit Be Extraordinary, Be You, which empowers youth to embrace their true selves and avoid substance use. To learn more about Heather and Randy Bacchus and their Be Extraordinary, Be You organization, check out the High Truth show notes. Heather and Randy Bacchus, welcome to High Truths.
Thank you, Dr. Lev.
Thank you for having us.
It's an honor to have you here. Everything I do because of parents like you. You are my moral compass. You inspire me by your energy and determination. And, years ago, I was connected with parents who were victims of opioid prescribing. And that was way before there was, national movement on dealing with the opioid issue. And sticking with the parents has been, what guided me. And now I have another set of parents like you who are victims of cannabis. And so I can't thank you enough. And I know it's not easy, but you do it because it brings you purpose.
Thank you. We're grateful for the opportunity, Dr. Lev.
So I thought we'd start with talking about your son, Randy. And I want to go through his journey and have you kind of telling me about his childhood and what kind of kid was Randy?
Well, Randy was the second of four kids, and he was always energetic, rambunctious, funny, humorous, very social, liked to play sports. He was football, hockey, lacrosse. He was a hard worker as he got into his. He always worked hard at school, and he always worked hard when he had a job. And so people would often say, like, he wasn't the smartest child by any means. He worked really hard to get B's and A's. He had ADHD, and overall, he was just a pretty normal kid. We did all the family things we should do, took him to the doctor, tried to read to them, make sure they were safe, have family dinners, go to church, do all the things that would help to raise happy, healthy kids. And, when he was 15, he was introduced to marijuana, and then things really changed for us.
So, how was he introduced to marijuana?
So at the time, he was hanging out with a couple neighbor kids that had just graduated high school. It was between his freshman and sophomore year. He was caught with them smoking pot. And at that time, we thought, oh, this is just kind of a coming of age. Kids are going to try to push boundaries. So the first time he was caught, we were really disappointed, but we had no idea what we were up against. We thought this is just marijuana, as everybody says, no big deal, right? Benign substance. So he started his sophomore year in high school. Those same boys came back at Christmas time from college, and he was caught again. And we started to see a pattern, and we were concerned, but we once again thought this is something that is not addictive, is what we were told. And from there, it just kind of things spiraled downward slowly. Wouldn't you say that, Heather?
Yeah, and I would say, Randy really tried to convince us that it was good for him, and that it, helped him with his creativity, helped settle his brain, helped him with his focus. He totally took all of the industry talking points and tried to convince us. It never sat well with me, and I was always very concerned because we do have, people who have struggled with substances in both sides of our family. So I was on heightened awareness and tried to help him understand that it wasn't good for him. But I didn't know the details and the science and the facts behind it. So as a mom, I didn't have that information to back it up. But really, he was easily hooked in. And I think it probably gave him a little temporary relief from his active brain. But in the long term, it caused some major changes, which brought more harm.
So he started at age 15?
15.
And then how long before he had a first psychotic episode?
So basically, before he got into that, when he was 16, turning 17, he was caught with a felony amount of edibles with a couple of kids in a park. So we sent him to wilderness therapy because this was about the fourth time he'd been caught. So he was a junior in high school. It was in the fall. We sent him to wilderness therapy. He went there and he was diagnosed with or just prior to going there, he was diagnosed with a cannabis use disorder. But we had no idea what that meant. We just knew that he really thought that cannabis was this great product or this cure-all. So after he went to wilderness therapy, he came back home and he was even worse than before he left. He eventually was
What do you mean by worse? Like using more? Or mentally worse?
Mentally.
I would say he was angry. And so, they suggested sending him to boarding school, but he did 9 weeks at wilderness therapy. In hindsight, it probably wasn't the right place for him. But we did what people like.
How would you know?
Yeah, you don't know. And we were talking to a therapist, and the therapist suggested that we send him to wilderness therapy. So that's what they did. We did. And then they wanted him to do boarding school. And that was not an affordable option for our family. So we brought him home, and we determined that he shouldn't go back to the high school he was at previously. So he had to switch to the public school in our area, which he knew kids, but it's a kind of a cliquier community. I guess all high schools are probably somewhat cliquey, and he really struggled. And we were having him earn back privileges. So we did what the wilderness people told us to do to help him come back. And unfortunately, it wasn't too long. It was probably a couple months, and he was using again. And eventually he got caught smoking at school. And, we had a zero tolerance policy. So he did go and live with our neighbors, actually, who lived 3 doors away for a short time. And then he wanted to get back into the house. So it was, what we saw initially was we saw a lot of, he couldn't regulate his moods. He was saying that he felt suicidal. We did have him in counseling the entire time, but it wasn't as if, it was like the counselors weren't really getting it. In fact, this particular counselor told us it was no big deal if he drove our daughters to school high, because he would just drive slower, which was heartbreaking. And that was the problem, is I just don't think people here, we're in Minnesota, they were not up to speed. And they're still probably not up to speed on the detriments that it causes. And consequently, we weren't either. So really, Randy, what we initially saw was anxiety, depression, withdrawal, dropping out of activities, struggling with some memory things. Although he worked and he really was social and saw friends and things like that, but he was kind of isolating, and that just was kind of getting worse. And really, his mood regulation was bad. He just could not keep it even, I guess.
So to give you an idea, his mood regulation, there was a couple times where we had to call the sheriffs. That was pretty embarrassing at first. The first time it happened, it was very embarrassing. It was during the day on a Sunday. And we had to call the sheriffs because he was being physical and he was being threatening. And, at the time, we thought it was just him having mental health issues. We had no idea what this correlation between this and cannabis and how this really does change the way our youth are operating, especially young, from what we're seeing, a lot of young men, the way that they respond and the way that they react to events. And so after having, a number of issues with him, he really did bring a lot of chaos to our home. But we had 3 girls. One of them was at college at the time. But every time we'd have family, home, or he was there, it just created a lot of chaos and a lot of struggles, a lot of arguments. It was a catalyst for a lot of problems in our home. And, once he was of age and he was 18, he graduated high school online. After struggling with him, he moved out to Colorado. We wanted him to stay home and go to school somewhere local. But in all fairness, he wanted to go to Colorado because he was accepted to Boulder, University of Colorado Boulder. But we just said, we're not going to pay for your college. This is not something, I guess.
Well, he made it pretty apparent that he thought college was for partying, and he made it apparent that he was going to be doing that, joining a fraternity, and he was going to have a good time. Where I was like, college is your job, it's your focus, and really, having fun is part of the experience, but it's not the main part. So what we encouraged him to do was to move out there, get his residency, take a gap year, and enroll in community college. And we really thought that would be the best for him. We really wanted him to stay close, as Randy said, but he had a dream to go out there, so he did. And once he got out there, it wasn't long. He got his medical marijuana card, I think, by the time he was 19. So he turned 19 the fall of what would have been his freshman year, and he had that medical marijuana card.
What was his medical diagnosis?
I am really not sure. And that was when it was much easier to get a medical marijuana card there. I have a feeling he probably was one of the kids that went to a concert and saw a doctor at the concert and got his card. If anything, he probably was thinking he was treating anxiety, or, that would be my guess.
Interesting.
So, yeah. And he didn't tell us he had a medical marijuana card. We found that out after he passed.
So this whole time he's using, and did he ever have an episode of psychosis, or this happened once he got to Colorado?
He threatened suicide when he was a senior in high school. And so at that point, he left the house. He dropped his cell phone on the front entry rug. He took a belt out the door. And this was the second night he had done that and this was all because he wanted to smoke marijuana. And we said no. And we had the police pick him up and they brought him to our hospital and they put him on a 3-day hold. But really nothing was ever brought up about any sort of psychosis at that point. The closest the doctor said there, she thought he was maybe mildly autistic, which Randy had been assessed 4 times between the ages of, say, kindergarten to 17, and no one had ever mentioned autism. But there was a change in him. They added anxiety and depression. He always had ADHD, mildly dyslexic, had some processing skills, but high memorization and high verbal acuity and written acuity. So he had some workarounds for his challenges, but he never had anxiety and depression until he was 17. And that was after he had started using. So we think his first psychotic episode was probably when he was, Randy, that would have been fall of 2019. Right. And we saw written evidence. He was working at a property management company and he called me and he said he was laid off. And we talked about that. And we later, after he passed, got into his journals and we saw a recording that he was actually fired and he had accused his employer of being in the mob. So that was, because he wasn't always with us, what we've come to understand now is that kids will operate on a fairly, like maybe 60% of the time they can operate fairly regularly. And then 40% of the time their brain isn't working correctly.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting how after he's passing, you're like reconstructing his life and seeing what's happening and what kind of as an opportunity for the medical community, instead of annoying me about the medical community, which I am part of, is you can't make a diagnosis of even like psychosis, schizophrenia, or whatever else he may have without eliminating drug use, right? So if all this time he has a cannabis use disorder and he has a documented case of cannabis use disorder, you can't ignore that when making mental health decisions and treatments. So,
well, I was going to say they really did. No one ever attributed anything to cannabis with him, which is shocking to me given what we know now. Back in 2018, I could sort of understand that, or maybe when he was really young, but when he was in Colorado, they've had it legal there for a number of years and they're seeing that activity. Why that wasn't addressed is hard for me.
And you'd be upset to find out that we're still not there yet, right? And if I'm reliving history with opioids, it took a while for the medical community to make that connection with like overprescribing and all the things that we're seeing in the emergency department. And right now, if I look at all the patients who are there on mental health holds, half of them have marijuana associated it, but we're not necessarily making that connection. Which is sad, because if you can make the connection, then you have an opportunity to fix the problem. Yeah. But tell me about his life in Colorado.
So he was out there. We were here. He talked to Heather a lot on the phone. We would communicate with him. He seemed to be doing very well. When he was a sophomore, which would have been a sophomore in college, he started taking classes at the local community college. I believe it was called Front Range. And, he had a couple jobs. He was always working. He had a lot of big dreams. And we thought, okay, he's doing better. He's kind of growing up. We were feeling like, hey, he's finally launching. But at the same time, we had no idea that he was using the quantities of marijuana that he was.
What was he using?
So he did a lot of vaping and he was smoking a lot of joints. And we didn't know the extent that he was using. We knew that he was using, but we didn't have any idea the potency or the number of times he was using per day.
And not the waxes and the oils, just...
we don't know on the waxes or the oils. I'm pretty sure that he probably used them if they were available. but we don't have documented information on that. But we do have information that he was vaping and smoking joints because we have video evidence of it after he passed.
We also know he was doing edibles as well. So
what was interesting is he would come home. So he came home a couple times after he moved out there. He came home a couple times, and he was always really good the first couple days. By day 4, he started kind of crawling out of his skin, and we thought it was because he just was kind of a turkey, kind of a jerk. We thought, okay, he's got some mental health issues, because by day 4, he was unbearable.
He was withdrawing.
He was withdrawing, and we didn't know that at the time. We thought, and sometimes he would then leave the house and he'd come back, and then he'd be much better. He'd all of a sudden be like a whole different person. So we thought, oh, he just needed some space to be able to get out on his own. Well, the fact of the matter was he was obviously going out and finding somebody who had some weed that was in the area. And so we fast forward, we thought he was doing all right. We did a trip out there in 2019. We went to Steamboat, Colorado, picked him up, took him out there with us. We all had a nice family Thanksgiving. It was really wonderful. And then he started kind of changing about 6-8 months later. We really started to see some big changes in him.
But I think,
what do you mean by that? What kind of changes that you saw?
Go ahead.
Well, I guess I would say, so he came home in 2020. So we really saw a difference in him. So COVID came about. So I think what happened in the fall of 2019, he was using, I think he started to experience some psychotic episodes based on what he journaled. So then he's got into working out, and he was working out really a lot, and he was in great shape. He was really paying attention to his diet. He would FaceTime me. He'd be making chicken. He'd be making rice, trying to eat healthy, and he would meal prep. So he was really into that for a while. Then COVID hit, and then everybody left Boulder, including his housemates. And he had to stay out there because he was working, and he still needed to be in the office. And he chose to stay out there. So I think then he started to uptick his use again. He came home in June of 2020, and he was very mellow. And I told him, I said, you seem different. You seem to have kind of matured or grown up. And we talked about that. And then he came home again in August. And again, I told him, I was really proud of him for being out there alone when he was so isolated, that he was working, and, that I was very proud of him and everything that he had been doing. And he told me that, he was still smoking and using marijuana. And I told him, and he said, if he doesn't use, it made him feel like he wanted to kill himself. And I said, well, there are other drugs that you can use that will, have been studied by doctors for years, that they've gone to school for years, that would be more appropriate. And he really didn't want to do that because he was sold and bought into marijuana, that it's this miracle. And unfortunately, when he went back after that visit, he abruptly quit a job. And I think that's because his brain wasn't working right. He got a new job. Eventually, our communication was dwindling with him. And we had a fear that he was probably using more often. And eventually in January, he reached out to us, and we had offered to bring him home for Christmas and the holidays, but both times he said no because he had gotten a new job. But in January, he really kind of went off the rails, and we communicated with him, but he called me and he was erratic. He was upset. He decided to move out of his house and move into Denver. But what we learned after he passed was that he was actually evicted for threatening his roommates. So we know that his use really started to uptick. So I would say his first psychotic episode was probably fall of 2019. Then 2020 was a year of adjustment. Then fall of 2020, it really picked up. His use is my speculation. And then in January, he was full on delusional. I mean, he thought he was going to be a famous rap artist. He was convinced, and he didn't have any musical talent or ability. He took guitar lessons for like 2 months when he was 7 or 8. Outside of that, he didn't have any talent. So he set up a makeshift recording studio in his closet. and he was writing lyrics and recording music. And we were really panicked and worried and didn't know what was going on. But we really didn't know what was going on because we had no idea that marijuana could cause that.
Yeah, what's interesting is there are episodes of people who smoke high potency and then have a sudden psychotic break, or what you're describing happened to your son is he used for years and it slowly developed this psychosis. It wasn't like boom, bad trip. It was a gradual progressive effect on the brain.
Yeah. That's what I believe. So if we fast forward into February, he was very aggressive. He was very vile. He was angry. He abruptly quit a job again in January. And then he still fully convinced he was going to become a rap artist. He also was hyper spiritual. He was texting Bible quotes. Prior to that, he had also told me he talked to God and to the devil. And I'm a spiritual person, so I wasn't like, again, I didn't know that hyper spirituality is a sign of psychosis, but definitely he had all of those signs. And then in March of 2021, he had a full blown psychotic episode where he called us and he said that the mob was after him. They were coming to get us. He needed a gun. He called my brother and said, I need a gun. He was just completely off the wall. And he called us at like 11 o'clock at night and we were panicked. We tried to reach him back, but we couldn't. So the following day, we did what would have been the first of our well checks on him. And the cops went to his door and they said that he said, hey, I was just smoking a little weed. I'm fine. Not to worry. And then we touched base with him that night. And I said, I think you need help. I said, will you agree to get help? And he said, yes. So we brought him to Denver Health Detox, and they admitted him to the ER or emergency department, and they did all these tests, and then they put him back out on the street at 6:30 in the morning. And while he was in that detox or the emergency department, we had a young gal who was a family friend there with him. And he said, can you hear the music? And she said, there was no music. And she said, I kept telling Randy, there is no music. And so he definitely was having auditory hallucinations. It was never noted. And again, they just put him back out on the street.
Sadly, we can't admit everybody with psychosis. I send people out on the street with psychosis and it breaks my heart, but I don't know what else to do.
Right.
So in the meantime so that was March 16th. I flew out, or I didn't fly out. I drove out to Denver. I helped Randy pack up his place. We were planning on having him coming back here and living here in Minnesota. So I flew with him down to the treatment center, which was in Boca. I believe it was Boca Raton or Deerfield Beach area of Florida. Dropped him off with the driver, flew back to Colorado, finished packing up his stuff, brought all of his stuff back to Minnesota. In the meantime, he went to detox for 4 days because of COVID. They didn't want to admit him to the treatment center until he had cleared that he didn't have COVID. So after 4 days in detox, they admitted him into the treatment center. Within an hour of him getting to the treatment center, we got a call from his therapist to do a virtual meeting. And at the virtual meeting, he said he had this all figured out. He was going to be able to get sober on his own. So he wrote on his own plan of how he was going to get sober, what he was going to do. And we told him, please stay at the treatment center. He left the treatment center in a hurry. He even left and forgot some of his stuff, which he went back and got later, but he was irrational. He found somebody that gave him a ride, and she had some marijuana that he smoked. After that, he was calm again. He was very easy to talk with. So he then made his way back to Colorado for a few days, took him to get back to Colorado. So keep in mind, through all this, he was never on our dime. We did not pay for him to live out in Colorado. The only thing we paid for was his cell phone. We would pay for if he wanted a flight to come back to Minnesota. We'd give him a Christmas gift and a birthday gift, but that was it. So he was on his own dime this whole time. And we really had no leverage. He was angry with us. He made his way back to Colorado and he was mad. He was very threatening for a couple weeks. And then Heather, if you want to talk about his next issue with
Sure.
his Denver Health.
So we,
At what point, I don't know if this was before Denver Health, did he actually purchase a gun?
that was in this in between period. So after he was let out from Denver Health, went to treatment, came home, he was just really not himself. And he did go and buy a legally registered gun. And that was for the paranoia that he had. He thought he needed the protection. And he told us that he bought a gun, but he was also threatening his dad.
But what I wonder is, and no matter where you are in the gun debate, if you want to ban all guns or everybody has their civil liberties and can have guns, I think everyone on both sides of the aisle of that gun debate would agree that somebody with mental health instability shouldn't have a gun.
Well, and Dr. Lev, I called out when he told me he was going to buy a gun. I called out to Colorado to find out what does it take to get a gun. And all it takes is a clean record. Randy didn't have a record.
But he had a mental health record.
He did. And so why are these systems not communicating? They should be communicating.
That's such a failure.
It's right. It needs to be changed. That's what needs to be changed is if somebody has a mental health issue or if they've been diagnosed with a substance abuse disorder, they have no business.
At this point, before he bought his gun legally, because he had no criminal record, how many mental health records has he had?
At least 3. I mean, and I don't know how much goes on if you're just seeing a therapist, but I mean, he saw a therapist in high school a couple different times. He went to wilderness therapy. He, was admitted to Denver Health at that point once prior for drugs. He had a medical marijuana card.
He was documented to have suicidal ideations. How many times? You told me in high school, and I mean, how many times in the medical record? I'm trying to think of what system can we put in place to flag this as a warning?
And that would be great. I am not sure, but the ironic thing is, Dr. Lev, what do they call it when they redact something from his autopsy report? They redacted something from his autopsy. And in calling and checking into that, what in the world would they redact? It would be a suicide attempt. So that is very strange to me that was in there as well. I just think we have to do better. Somehow those mental health systems have to communicate.
And I think, not to blame Denver Health, but the simple fact is he goes in there and obviously we don't have privy to his records at that time, but he sends us the paperwork that he had and it said he had a substance use disorder and they recommended him going to therapy. But nobody ever talked about CIP or cannabis-induced psychosis. So none of this was ever discussed at all. So this was on middle of March. So March 15th or 16th is when he went to Denver Health the first time. And as you said, Heather said in high school, he was a senior. He was admitted to a local hospital here for threatening suicide. But then we fast forward a month later from his visit to Denver Health, he calls the police and says, I feel suicidal. I don't feel safe.
Well, that's on the record, right? That's on a police record. That's not even a HIPAA record, HIPAA protected privacy record. There's some record with the police that the guy was suicidal.
So what the police did is but the police took his gun. We thought that they confiscated his gun. That's what we understood. And keep in mind, we're 4 states away from there. So this is not like this is in our backyard. We can just go to the police station. But we understood it as that they confiscated his gun. What they actually did was they took his gun and put it back in his safe and then took him to Denver Health. So he goes to Denver Health. There's not enough beds. Long story short, the doctor says, I can try to commit him, but he tried to get him in there for 3 days, but he says there's just not enough beds available. He said, even if we try to commit him.
That time, is that the one where he cut his wrists?
That was the prior time. That was the time in March. So this was April 18th of 2021. And the doctor just said, I can't really keep him here because he's talking. Now he seemed like he was sane and he seemed like he was fine. So they let him out. But nobody told us when we talked to that doctor that cannabis would cause this. We thought he just had mental health issues. And nobody ever said cannabis-induced psychosis or any of these things that we know
Yeah,
now.
we tend to ignore that. We still do ignore that. Um, I'm trying to think of like what, as I even like I'm hearing Vandy's story of like what would I do differently if I was the ER doctor, and I could do the same. I would, like if you're there with, we call it drunkicidal. People come in, they're drunk and they're suicidal, and they sober up, and now they're not suicidal. We let them out, and we have it with methamphetamine. We have that with cannabis. Is after you detox, if you're not suicidal, and again, there's such a like in Denver, but it's all over the United States. We don't have mental health beds, so we look for reasons to release someone for outpatient. So I could have done the same thing.
Yeah. And I think the hard part is he, prior to that, he was so angry and so vile. And then when he went in for that hospitalization in April, it's almost like something flipped in his brain, and he came out and he was more like our normal son. He was more pleasant. He wasn't angry, and he apologized for his behavior. He was remorseful. It was like a switch in his head flipped.
That was after the last hospitalizations?
Yes. Yeah.
And so the police you thought they took his gun, but they didn't actually take it.
No. So it was put in his personal safe. And in my head, I was relieved because the doctor told me it had been confiscated, and
that's what we think.
sitting.
That's what, I'm not the police. If the police tell me the gun is safe, then like how would I know any differently?
Right. So that's what I think he believed, and then that wasn't the reality. But as a mom, I was relieved because I didn't think he had it anymore. But then fast forward, he wanted to do family therapy. He didn't want to admit that he had a problem and he needed the help. He thought family therapy would fix everything. So we agreed, if you find a therapist, and we were encouraged by the treatment center to at least just get him into therapy. And with all the behavior he had that was aggressive, I told the therapist, and she said, well, let's have him evaluated by a psychiatrist. So he saw a PA of psychiatry, and she diagnosed him with anxiety, depression, ADHD, bipolar, mood disorder, PTSD. Randy, did I forget anything?
It was like cannabis-induced psychosis.
But there was no cannabis-induced psychosis on there. It was psychosis resolved. So it wasn't cannabis, just psychosis resolved. Simple fact is he had cannabis-induced psychosis, and obviously, of all the states to be in, Colorado or California, which had a long history of this, they should have known that. But they didn't. And so then he wanted to, part of the thing with him going to the psychiatrist, so he saw a PA psychiatrist, was our physician's assistant psychiatrist, was he wanted to be able to go back in his ADHD medicine, which he hadn't had since he was since he was 17 or 18 years old. He thought that would help him with his brain. And he ended up, they prescribed him Adderall, which at the time, we didn't have any idea of all these things that are interacting with each other. It was kind of like a perfect storm. So the Adderall makes the highs higher and the lows lower, is what we come to find out. And you put that on top of the cannabis-induced psychosis, he had a real storm brewing inside of him.
Well, and I wonder, he wasn't sleeping, so we could see from like his records, his emails, because we had access, that he was up all night emailing, and he would text people that we knew in the middle of the night. So I don't think he was sleeping. I think he may have transitioned to like a bipolar, that cannabis-induced psychosis was settling in as bipolar, possibly. And that Adderall is not, from my understanding, not something you give to somebody with bipolar.
Right.
Yeah.
But what really brought this all to fruition and gave us the answers was, after he passed, I was able to get into his computer and I was able to get into his phones. It took a couple months to get into his phones, but I did. And from there, it told our story, our son's story, from his perspective, because he thought he was going to be a rap star. So he recorded all this footage of him smoking weed and recording music. So he thought he was going to be this famous rap artist, that at some point he could use this as kind of like this was my past, and now here's where I am at my future. The beauty of that footage was that footage is now used to be able to show other kids, in particular, his transition and how this benign substance, which is not a benign substance, really caused his deterioration and his mental health issues. So it was a gift and a godsend afterwards because it gave us answers.
Wait, you have video of your son personality changing over time that he recorded?
Yeah.
Ugh, yeah.
Yeah, and what we really saw was he was in the same day, he was two different people. He would call us and leave a positive voicemail, and then he would do a video recording of himself that he was talking about how down he was and that he knew he was kind of going crazy. So that was the interesting part, is that there were two sides to him.
What did you do with all this video? What have you done with this video that obviously is very painful to watch?
So I took and put together the video. Heather and I put together a video with his footage, and we use it now. So we've got about a 14-minute video. I've had a couple hours of video footage, and so I went through that and found the stuff that was most pertinent. And we use that now when we go around and talk with, whether it be parents, kids, communities, about the harms of today's marijuana. And we use that video because we feel, and we've been told from the kids and the youth, that makes more of an impact than us giving them stats and numbers.
Yeah.
Because it shows his deterioration. And sadly, I mean, all these things that we know now, most of these we had no idea when he was alive. We thought our son had issues. He was out in Colorado. He smoked some weed. But we didn't realize until he passed how much weed he smoked, how often he smoked, and how strong this stuff was.
Wow.
We were never happy that he was smoking weed. But if I think of weed when I was in high school in the 80s, I thought,
Whenever you got caught smoking in the bathroom, it's like, oh,
Yeah, I thought, it's something that maybe it was a coming of age at the time. But the simple fact of the matter is this pot today, especially this industry, which I call it pot propaganda, pot propaganda. So I've shortened it to pot propaganda. What they tell people and what this stuff actually is it's like David and Goliath. This stuff is so strong, and it can go up to, as 99%. On average, smokable weed is 23%. This stuff is no longer the pot that when I was in high school, it's 8 times stronger just for marijuana joints. And in going through, so how do I tie all this back, is this video that we put together shows these kids this real life transition of this young man who thought he had the world by the tail and was a hard worker. He wasn't lazy, but it shows him how his dreams became death and a true reality.
Nightmare. Tell me about his last hospitalizations and what happened.
So fast forward to the end of June, July, he was, like I said, more mellow. He was very appreciative. We had done some family sessions with his therapist, and he was very appreciative. He was very like, thank you for my sheltered upbringing. I know that you guys tried to do all of these good things for me, and he was just appreciative. And so he seemed like he was doing pretty good. We knew he was concerned about his health bills, and we were trying to work through with him, encouraging him to call the hospital, set up a payment plan. We were trying to help him guide, and we had guarded hearts because we had been hurt.
What kind of bill did he get?
He received a $15,000 bill for his emergency visit in March and a $8,000 bill for his overnight stay in April.
And he didn't have insurance?
He didn't have insurance. He would have had eligibility for Medicaid, I think, or whichever one helps those who don't have an income at the time, for his April visit. But And I had sent him articles like, this is what you do if you can't pay your hospital bill. They will sometimes adjust it, or you can do monthly payments.
What a
Just,
responsible young man.
yeah. And
That he cares about that. I mean, first of all, the bills are ridiculous, and don't think that as a physician, I've seen those bills and I know they're ridiculous. Like, who can afford that? And on the other hand, what a responsible young man that just shows about his character. I think most people would be like, whatever, throw it in the trash. I'm not paying attention to this.
yeah, no, he was he was obsessed with that a little bit because he was worried. And I think his concern was, he was kind and gentle to the homeless people on the street, and he would tell me of his interactions with them. He had a huge heart. And I think he was afraid that he was going to end up on the street also. I do believe that. But if we fast forward, he called me on Friday, July 16th, and I knew he was not himself. He was sad. He was down. He talked to me about small claims court because he had his, Dr. Lev, we didn't say, but he did some kind of crazy bad decision-making things. He bought an old Corvette that he thought would be his project car that he would fix up. So financially, he was responsible, but he also made some poor choices. So he had this Corvette that,
or he was manic.
Yes, he was manic, I think. And so
when you're manic, you make weird purchases and things like that.
Yeah. So he did do that, and he had this Corvette, and he brought it in, and he thought they ruined it. So he wanted to take them to small claims. He also wanted to get money back from his recording that he was doing. And so we were talking through that. And then I just said, we'll talk tomorrow. Good night. I love you. He said, love you too. Say hi to the girls for me. And then probably, I think it was at like 11 something, he sent me another text, and I texted him back, love you, good night. And then he sent us a text, I think at 12:40 or so, that just said, I'm done with music. I'm done with weed. I'm going to hang around with happy, healthy people. It's time for me to own up and start living a good life. I put you guys through way too much. So it was a very hopeful text. And then 40 minutes later, he sent a text and he said, I love you, Mom. I'm sorry. Please tell Dad the same. I wish I would have been a better person. And when I woke up to that the next morning, it didn't set well. But I think I was in denial. And I texted him right back and it said, today is a new day. We can always have a fresh start. Just tried to encourage him as, a mom would do. And then we didn't hear from him. Keep in mind, all the while, I was really anxious the whole weekend because we weren't hearing back from him. And eventually, our oldest daughter came home on Sunday night. And then on Monday, I just got beside myself with anxiety and worry because we hadn't heard from him. And, when we texted him, he wouldn't always answer. But when he texted us, he expected an answer right back. So it wasn't uncommon. We might have to wait a couple days. But I called his place of employment and said, has Randy been at work? And she was angry and she said, no, he hasn't been at work. Well, then I was really concerned and upset. And so we called and did a well check on Randy. And then we received a call that evening that it appeared he had died by suicide. And at that moment, just everything changed. Like our whole world went upside down, and we just started asking like, why? And as a mom, initially, I knew he suffered mental health, and I talked about it when I spoke at his funeral. I said he suffered mental health and he medicated with marijuana for it. And now in hindsight, with all that I've learned, I know that he may have had ADHD, but I truly believe that marijuana brought on the depression, the anxiety, and then consequently psychosis and mania, bipolar.
Yeah, right. And you could see that because when he's off of it, he didn't have it. And then when he had it, and I don't know, it's painful, but he used that gun to end his life. The one that you were so, afraid of. And
yeah. And the difference was, in the past, when he threatened suicide, it was out of like anger, and it was out of frustration because he wanted to use marijuana and he wanted us to say, it's okay for you to use marijuana. And he would say it like, if you won't let me smoke, I'm going to kill myself. The difference was this time we're Catholic. So he went to confession the Tuesday evening before. We didn't know, we were like, okay. And he came home and he said, I'm just so thankful because I don't have to say I'm sorry anymore. And we were like, oh, good, but that was really another precursor, another sign of his suicidality. And we weren't aware. His brain just was not working right.
We've heard that now from several parents whose children ended their life with suicide is when they came to the understanding that marijuana was destroying their brain, but they also were addicted and they can't stop, that triggered that degree of frustration.
Well, and I was just reading through some notes that I hadn't read for a while, and he Googled Jesus 3 times before he took his life. So we have access to all of that. And then he wrote in his journal, he wrote, "Can I live for Jesus?" And then he wrote once more, "Can I?" And I think in his head, he, probably he wanted to quit and he was questioning, could he do it? Because he had sent his therapist a note that he had used, but he had used alcohol that night and he had bought something small because we saw his credit card receipt and it was for like a $4 item. It wasn't anything bad. And then when his autopsy came, we did the toxicology. He had low levels of THC and low levels of alcohol in his system. And that was it. So I think he was depressed because he was trying to quit. He was in that withdrawal period and, maybe his brain, maybe he heard something that told him, I don't really know.
Right. You may not know that, but I think you do know that THC had a lot to do with his mental health deterioration that led up to
100%.
suicide. So I would have no problem saying that this was a marijuana associated suicide.
Yes.
Right.
I totally agree.
What he also did was after he had started taking the Adderall, he told Heather that he used less weed at that point. The Adderall was helping him stay focused and he was needing to use less weed. And that's why, at the time we thought, okay, why does he have low levels of THC? That didn't help us after when we saw his autopsy. But once we started
everywhere, if you want to quit smoking, there's resources everywhere for you of how to quit smoking. But if you want to quit using marijuana, we don't have the resources for you. Not to the degree that we should have, or that we have with tobacco. But he wanted that, but he needed assistance and even medications to assist with that.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So, I know you, and your life is never the same. Not just you, but your children, your daughters also. I mean, you're forever affected. But I guess Randy and Heather, what inspires me about you is that, that's, I don't know, the depth of hell for your son, but also for you and your family. And you turn that pain to purpose. And you went on your journey that you just shared with us of like deconstructing his life, from his journal and his videos and his phone and his computer that, you obsessed with to figure out, to like understand what happened to your beautiful child. And so you've entered this journey that you shared with us, but also you entered this other educational journey. And tell us about that.
Well, when we lost Randy, like I said, I knew that he struggled with mental health and then I thought he was self-medicating. But then I was handed an article by a good friend of mine who read People magazine, and she saw Laura Stack's article and she shared it with me. And then that was the beginning of an opening of a window of tons of information that helped us take all of our pieces and put them together. And so, like Dr. Lev, I started listening to your podcast. And I would listen to it religiously. And I would listen to some of the episodes multiple times because it helped me come to the understanding of what happened. And so between you and Laura Stack, really you helped both of you helped us put together pieces that we figured we know so much information now, what happened with him, with the information that you had, that we have to share it, because we were kind of given a gift in the sense that we know what happened. So many people lose their loved one to suicide and they don't have a clue. We got a whole complete picture, and we just want to help prevent it from happening to other families so they don't have to live through it. I was with 3 other moms last night whose kids are living, but that have been psychotic and now are, in recovery or working on recovery, but their kids will never be the same. And they too they're grieving the loss of who their child was and trying to figure out how to live with their new child who will never probably be able to live on their own in those cases.
Or meet their potential. This is all preventable.
Yeah, and that's it. It's all preventable. So we feel it's so important to get the word out there to educate parents and kids so that they can make informed decisions, because I do think had I had the knowledge and the science behind it and was able to share that with my son at a younger age, then maybe he wouldn't have chosen to use the substance. And I do believe he would still be here today. Would he be perfect? I always say he wouldn't be perfect, because none of us are, but he would be here and we'd be able to love him up, hug him, get to know what his dreams and aspirations were, see what he would be able to accomplish in life. So that's our hope, is to share so that others don't have to go through it, because it's awful.
Yeah. So I say that if anybody's listened to all my podcasts and you've listened to them multiple times, which I think you've now beat my own mother, who I think is like listens to every episode. But it's like a master's degree in addiction, because I look at all aspects of drugs, from law enforcement to journalists who go to drug labs and all, and everything. So I don't know, anybody who's listened to every episode like that is definitely highly educated, and you, again, you didn't just take that information for yourself, you're sharing that. And it's in a lovely way, like even here on this podcast and with Johnny's Ambassadors and Every Brain Matters and Smart Approaches on Marijuana, all these organizations, you have now, figured out to absorb information, but also you're giving back tremendously.
That's what we hope. And we're everything in our world has become bittersweet. Like, we know we've had a lot of good experiences because we had this one bitter thing happen. And that's where it's kind of hard to wrap your head around. So I have a great sense of gratitude and also an immense sense of sadness that we hold, but we are very grateful to have connected with a lot of wonderful groups across the country that hopefully are going to make big changes so that people don't have to suffer.
And all the other blessing I see you guys have is with each other. I mean, what a great husband and wife team. I mean, deaths can tear families apart like that, especially such, tragically. And that you both are obviously a team in this journey.
Well, we really need to be, because the fact of the matter is, we can't blame one another. We did what we thought was right at the time. We took the steps we thought that would make him better and okay. Unfortunately, those things just did not work. So we can't really live in regret, because we did everything that we thought was right at that time. And both of us kind of made a commitment. Heather's a very strong woman. Because of Heather, we're doing the education. It doesn't mean that I didn't want to initially, but I wasn't sure I wanted to carry that cross. But I can tell you that since we have been out educating people, it does make a difference to us. It makes us heal a little bit each time. It's never going to take away the pain, but it helps us. I think the other piece is that's really important, and this is one thing that Heather and I talk about, because we are a team. When we first started having issues with our son in high school, I kind of chalked it up as just being a youth and trying to use and trying to test his boundaries. And truth of the matter is he had a problem. And it took me, I don't know, a year and a half before I finally was on the same page with Heather. And that's when we sent him to wilderness therapy. So what fathers need to know is that as a father, a lot of times we don't want to push these issues. We think they're just going to take care of themselves. And that our kids can, if they're using marijuana, they can quit at any time. Truth of the matter is they can't, and they need our help. And for those fathers that are out there that kind of question a lot of this, listen to your inner self and listen to your wife, because your child needs you. And though it may seem difficult, it will be better in the end if you can be involved and be helpful to this process.
Wow.
Is that fair?
That's powerful. Yeah. And can I ask how your daughters are doing?
Yeah, they are doing well. It's been a journey for all of them. They all had a different relationship with Randy. The oldest one was kind of the fixer. She always tried to keep peace, so she would try to make Randy happy. And she was gone for a lot of the chaotic times in the house. But the one right next to Randy, initially she was kind of following in his footsteps. And I told her early on, I said, you have a choice to make. You either choose right or you follow him, and life will be really hard. And she chose right. So that was good. And then the youngest one, they were kind of playmates. So the girls have all had to process it. You know, they all had to kind of cut him off when he was being angry and vile. And that was hard because the only one who saw him or talked to him prior to his passing was Brooke, the oldest. And she thought maybe she said something that set him off. But we've worked through a lot. The girls are under the understanding that Randy was very sick. We talk a lot about marijuana. I think they got a little frustrated because I was pretty obsessed about the whole thing initially, just trying to come to terms with all of it ourselves. But they know the impact, they know the dangers. They try and share that information with others, and they are helping us along in our journey. Our oldest has done some speaking regarding it. And
wow, that's awesome.
Yeah. And the middle one will graduate from nursing. And I'm like, maybe you want to be the cannabis nurse give the truth about cannabis. And the youngest one wants to help us with our social media and things like that. So they're all processing it. And I think it will impact them throughout their lives. But they all know,
wow.
Yeah, they all know Randy, was suffering. And we all believe he's at peace now. So that's good too.
Wow. And so Randy and Heather, you guys have gone not just education, but policy making. You've testified in Minnesota. You just had a bill in Washington, D.C.? Tell us about some of that.
We were out in Washington, D.C., and we met with a couple of legislators. Pete Sessions, a representative from congressperson from Texas, and then Pete Ricketts, senator from Nebraska. They came up with Randy's resolution. And basically what Randy's resolution is studying the effects of today's high potency marijuana and kind of looking at it so that we have a better understanding of what these products are today. So right now it's just a resolution, but it would be ideal if the United States would put that into a law where they start studying this versus allowing all these states just to keep passing marijuana laws that are supposedly favorable to the communities that are most harmed.
That's great. You know what? The episode I did just before you was with Dr. Rayler, and he is in the CDC Cannabis Strategy Unit. So, maybe you should send me, if you send me that resolution, I will send it to him. So that could be on the forefront, or maybe if the resolution develops further, his cannabis unit, it's just a couple people with no funding, right? So there's a lot, funding this unit could be something that would go a long way. That would probably not be too controversial.
And that's the hard part about this whole, our advocacy is really, we are fighting a giant. And when I say a giant, this industry, basically you've got Altria that is involved. You've got a lot of big companies. There's a lot of big money at stake. And, you know, for us to come out and speak and for Sam to speak and yourself to speak, it's difficult because the other side has so much money behind it that it sometimes feels unsurmountable. But I do know that in 10 years, and maybe it'll be less, we are going to see this whole thing come back because it is going to backfire for what all these states have done. All this short-term revenue is going to cause so many long-term problems that I do believe we are going to see, just like we did with tobacco and just like we did with Juul vape devices.
Right.
This is going to come back to haunt America and haunt our youth.
It is now, but we'll have the documentation for it a little, but it's harming
Truly.
today and yesterday. But yeah, so right. So I wish you guys luck with that. And in addition to that, you've done television appearances. You've been on Dr. Phil, and you'll be on a documentary. And are they using the video of Randy in these movies?
I think that's been a crucial point, or part of it is that it does show his journey, and we call it our son's journey with marijuana, and it really does document his last 8 months of his life, and it showcases a young man that really wanted a lot of good things that ended up unfortunately ending his life because he couldn't see all the beauty that he had.
Yeah. It kind of reminds me, Dr. DeForte is a psychiatrist and world-renowned researcher in the UK. And one of the things she does with her patients in the hospital, I thought is very creative. They'll say, you know what, I play music better with cannabis, or I can do my job interview better if I have a little bit of weed before my job interview. And she'll say, you know what, let's check out your theory. And she'll videotape them. And then when they're sober, have them watch that video. And it's like, do you think that your music was better? And they get to see that cognitive dissonance, like, whoa, I guess not. Right? Because your perception, people think that they're playing music better. They think that they're driving better, but they're not. They just don't see that.
Well, and isn't there a study out there that talks about the creativity, that they did a study, and in all reality, people realize, or they really aren't more creative. They just are more open to the possibility of being creative. I can't remember the study, but it's out there. I think Dr. Huberman talked about it.
You're now the expert, Heather. You've took your mission to understand your son to the point where you are now an expert and know a lot of these studies and information better than probably most in the medical field. So because you made that your focus. So I'm proud of you. I'm amazed. I'll be asking you.
Oh, I don't know about that, but I just, when you love something a lot, like you love a child, you want to know what's going on. And then you have people who might question you and doubt you, and you got to have the facts to back it up. So that's what I try to do.
Yeah. So what is your, final words, advice, hopes, going forward for you two?
Well, our hope is that we can continue to educate people, and that the video will continue to help people. Our son, before he passed, he said, Mom, I want to help people, and I want to help people get better. And the reality was, I said, Randy, first you have to help yourself. You have to take care of yourself. You have to do the work. You have to get healthy, and then you can help people. And so I guess we hope to be able to continue to educate kids and parents and families about the dangers of today's marijuana, so that they can avoid further tragedy. And that I think Randy would be really pleased with that. And I think he's helping us along in our mission, but
he is going to be helping people. You're going to make sure that his dream comes through.
Yes. And so I guess that's what I would say. And I don't know if Randy has anything to add.
No, I just think it's important what we're doing. At times I wish some people took it more seriously from the standpoint of parents. We do a lot of events, and we get some parents showing up, but there's so many more parents that need to be there and to hear the story, and they need to understand what these products are, because this is not the stuff that we grew up with. This isn't even remotely close. These are no longer plants. These are concentrates and distillates. And sadly, people just really, truly need to wake up and understand what they're up against. So we will continue to keep on fighting the fight and advocating and educating. And along the way, we will probably never know who we've helped, but if we can help a small percentage of people, then we know we've done really good work. And that's what our focus is.
Wow. I want to thank you guys. I know that Randy's memory is a blessing to both of you and your family. And I see how you take your pain into purpose. And again, you inspire me. I'm very thankful for your bravery and being able to be so open and insightful and sharing. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Dr.
for having
Lev.
us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for all the information you've shared and helped us with. I mean, it was pivotal for recovery for me. So thank you.
Thank you for being a light in the darkness. Thank you.
Yes.
Oh, you don't know how much that means to me.
True.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to High Truths on Drugs and Addiction, where you learn from experts from around the globe and around all aspects of drugs and addiction. This week's episode would not be possible without the generous support of our sponsor. A sincere and warm thank you to Physicians for Healthy Communities. Visit physiciansforhealthycommunities.org and view their video and resource library. High Truths producer is Dave Rivas from Davey Boy Productions. I'm your host, Dr. Ronit Lev. We hope we brought your day a little bit more High Truths.